The silence in the Triana apartment wasn't merely an absence of sound. It was a presence, thick and settled like the dust motes dancing in the slanted morning light cutting through the Persiana blinds. Mateo Alvarez, 67 years widowed and retired, moved through it with the careful, measured tread of a man navigating treacherous terrain. His right knee, a souvenir from a damp construction site visit decades ago, announced each step with a dull, insistent ache. He ignored it, as he ignored the slight tremor in his hand when he lifted the small cup of Café Solo, black and bitter like his mood most mornings. He sat at the small kitchen table, the worn oilcloth cool beneath his forearms. Outside, the Calle Pereza was slowly waking up, the clatter of a shop shutter rolling up, the distant, cheerful cry of a fruit vendor, the faint, rhythmic clapping that might have been an early flamenco practice drifting from somewhere unseen. Sounds of life. Here inside, only the tick of the old wall clock his Sophia had insisted on buying, its pendulum swinging with relentless, indifferent regularity. He unfolded the newspaper, ABC, his habit for 40 years, but the headlines blurred, meaningless. The real news was the relentless march of days, each one an echo of the last, stretching into a future he didn't want to contemplate. His appearance, like the apartment, spoke of a former solidity now fraying at the edges. His hair, once thick and black, was now mostly grey, though stubborn dark streaks remained, like resistance fighters refusing to surrender. Deep-set brown eyes, shadowed by fatigue, peered out from a face mapped by sun and worry, the legacy of providing, of enduring. He still wore a crisp, albeit slightly dated white shirt even at home, a relic of the days when presenting a proper image felt essential, a shield against the chaos of the world. The shield felt heavy now and useless. The phone rang, its shrillness violating the quiet. He knew who it was before he picked up. Elena, always Elena. "Dígame," he answered, his voice gruff, unwelcoming. "Papa, how are you this morning?" Her voice, practical, tinged with that familiar edge of concern that always felt like accusation to him. Fine, like always. A lie. The near fall yesterday, reaching for the olive oil on the top shelf, the sudden dizzying lurch and the sharp explosion of pain in his knee as he'd grabbed the counter still unnerved him. He hadn't told her. Wouldn't. "Did you sleep well? You sound tired." "I slept fine," he snapped, irritation flaring. Why did she probe? "Is there something you need?" A sigh on the other end. He pictured her, 40-something, juggling her own family, her stressful job at the bank, and him. Always him, the stubborn old anchor dragging her down. "No, Papa, just calling to check in. Have you thought about what I said?" "About seeing Dr. Ramirez? Just for a checkup. Your blood pressure. My blood pressure is my business," he cut her off. "I feel fine. Stop fussing." Weakness, a voice inside him hissed, showing weakness is the first step to losing everything. He'd learned that lesson early, watching his own father toil until he dropped, never complaining, never yielding. "Papa, please. It's been ages, and Javier worries too." Javier, his son, living in London, a world away, easier to worry from a distance. "Tell Javier I'm fine. Tell him to call his father once in a while." The bitterness surprised even him. "He tries, Papa. You know how busy he is." Elena started, but Mateo didn't want to hear excuses. "I have things to do," he said abruptly. Another lie. His days were vast, empty canvases. "Adios, hija." He hung up before she could reply, the silence rushing back in, heavier this time, tinged with guilt and a loneliness he refused to name. He pushed the feeling down, burying it under the familiar weight of resentment. Fussing women. Always fussing. Sophia had been the same towards the end, her gentle suggestions about his cough, his fatigue, met with the same irritable defensiveness. He missed her nagging now, more than he could bear to admit. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, placed it precisely on the drying rack. Order. Routine. These were the guardrails keeping him from skidding off the edge. He decided to walk. Maybe down by the river, the Guadalquivir, its slow buff, relentless flow a mirror to his own stagnant days. He put on his blazer, checked his reflection, a stooped, grey man staring back, and locked the door behind him, the click echoing in the empty stairwell. Triana pulsed with a life that felt increasingly alien to him. Tourists marvelled at the ceramic facades, their bright colours a stark contrast to the muted tones of his own existence. The smell of churros frying mingled with the scent of jasmine spilling over a balcony wall. He kept his eyes down, navigating the familiar uneven pavement, his limp more pronounced today. He passed the tapas bar where he and his work colleagues used to gather after long weeks wrestling with supply chains and demanding clients. Paco's son ran it now, music blaring, unfamiliar faces spilling onto the pavement. It wasn't his place anymore. None of it felt like his place. He remembered the relentless pressure of those years. 40 years at the same construction supply company, climbing slowly to mid-level management. The responsibility had been immense, a physical weight, ensuring deliveries arrived on time, managing difficult workers, placating angry contractors, always under the shadow of economic downturns that could wipe out jobs overnight. He'd worked punishing hours, brought the stress home like a contagion, infecting the atmosphere, silencing Sophia's laughter, making him a distant figure to his own children. He'd provided, yes, a good apartment, education, holidays once a year, but the cost had been connection, intimacy. He'd poured everything into being the cabeza de familia, the provider, leaving nothing for the husband, the father. And now, the role that had defined him was gone, leaving a void he didn't know how to fill. Retirement wasn't the golden reward promised in brochures. It was a sentence, an erasure. He reached the riverbank, leaning heavily on the railing, watching the water slide brown and opaque towards the sea. A tour boat chugged past, filled with waving, smiling people. He turned away. The sun felt weak, the breeze carried a chill that seeped into his bones. Autumn was settling over Seville, mirroring the autumn of his own life. Suddenly the ground seemed to tilt. A wave of dizziness washed over him, more intense than yesterday. The world swam, greyed at the edges. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His breath came short, ragged. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his usual defences. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying it would pass, praying no one would notice the old man trembling by the river. Not here. Not like this. The thought was a raw plea. When the spinning slowly subsided, leaving him shaky and nauseated, the fear didn't recede. It lingered, cold and undeniable. This wasn't just fatigue, this wasn't just his knee. Something was wrong. Elena found him sitting rigidly on the worn sofa when she let herself into the apartment later that afternoon, using the key he'd reluctantly given her for emergencies. His face was pale, his usual gruffness replaced by an unnerving stillness. A half-eaten plate of lentejas, cold and congealed, sat on the small table beside him. "Papa?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. "What happened? You didn't answer your phone." He waved a dismissive hand, but the gesture lacked its usual force, nothing, just resting. She wasn't fooled. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water. She knelt beside him, ignoring his instinctive recoil. "You look terrible. Did you fall again?" He hesitated. The fear by the river was still too close, too real. The image of himself collapsing helpless flashed in his mind. "No," he lied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just a little dizzy spell earlier, by the river." "Dizzy?" Elena's eyes narrowed. "Papa, that's it. We're going to see Dr. Ramirez, now." "Don't be ridiculous, Elena. It was nothing. The sun." "The sun? It's October. I'm not arguing about this." She stood up, her practical nature taking over. "Get your jacket, I'll call for a taxi." He wanted to refuse, to assert his authority, his independence. But the memory of that terrifying helplessness by the Guadalquivir, the cold premonition it carried, weakened his resolve. Arguing felt exhausting, pointless. For the first time in years, the ingrained resistance faltered. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound like air escaping a punctured tire. Defeat. He nodded curtly, avoiding her gaze, and slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. The clinic was bright, sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic. Dr. Ramirez, a brisk woman younger than Elena, listened patiently, tapping notes onto a tablet, her expression unreadable. Mateo answered her questions reluctantly, minimizing his symptoms, deflecting inquiries about his lifestyle. Yes, his knee hurt. Always. No, he didn't exercise. What for? Yes, he enjoyed jamon and queso. Who didn't? No, he didn't really monitor his salt intake. Stress? He'd handled stress his whole life. The examination was efficient, impersonal. Blood pressure cuff tightening, stethoscope cold against his chest, prodding fingers exploring the swollen knee joint. Then came the verdict, delivered in calm, measured tones that somehow felt more damning than shouting. "Senor Alvarez, your blood pressure is dangerously high, 170/100. You're lucky you haven't had a stroke. The dizziness is almost certainly related. She tapped the screen. And this knee, the arthritis is severe. Years of neglect haven't helped. You're also showing signs of prediabetes. Matteo stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He felt a dull flush creep up his neck. Exposed, judged. I'm prescribing medication for the blood pressure. You must take it every day, Matteo, no exceptions, and something for the inflammation in your knee. But medication alone isn't enough. We need to talk about lifestyle changes. Diet, less salt, less fat. Gentle exercise, walking, perhaps swimming. And physiotherapy for the knee is essential. It can significantly improve your mobility and reduce pain. She paused, meeting his gaze directly. Ignoring this is no longer an option. Elena, sitting beside him, squeezed his arm. We'll make sure he does, Doctora. Thank you. Outside, clutching the prescriptions, Matteo felt a surge of resentment. Lifestyle changes, physiotherapy, pills every day like an invalid. It was an admission of defeat, a surrender to the decay he felt creeping in. Nonsense, he muttered as Elena flagged down a taxi. All this fuss over nothing. Nothing? Papa, did you hear her? Dangerously high. A stroke. Elena's voice was trembling with a mixture of fear and exasperation. You have to take this seriously. I've lived my life without doctors telling me how to eat or walk, he retorted stubbornly, climbing stiffly into the taxi. He filled the prescriptions at the pharmacia near his apartment, the colourful boxes feeling alien in his hands. Back in the silence of his flat, he shoved them into a kitchen drawer behind the spare tablecloths. He'd take them later. Maybe. When he felt like it. The physiotherapy referral form joined them in the drawer's dusty depths. The next few weeks fell into a pattern of resistance. He continued his solitary routines, his walks shorter now, his knee a constant, grinding reminder of the doctor's words. He ate his usual fare, stews thick with chorizo, fried fish, generous slices of manchego, telling himself a little pleasure was necessary. He tried taking the blood pressure pills for a few days, but the simple act felt like capitulation. He started forgetting them, the unopened boxes mocking him from the drawer. Elena called daily, her questions about medication and appointments becoming more persistent. He deflected, obfuscated, sometimes lied outright. Their conversations grew shorter, taut with unspoken tension. He knew he was pushing her away, replicating the distance he'd created years ago, but the alternative, admitting his fear, his need for help, felt impossible, a betrayal of the man he'd always strived to be. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive quiet of the apartment, he found himself near his old office building. He stood across the street, watching people hurry in and out, young men in sharp suits, women talking animatedly on phones. Ghosts of his former self. He remembered the camaraderie, the shared jokes over bad coffee, the satisfaction of closing a difficult deal. He'd belonged there. Now he was just an old man lingering on the pavement, invisible. A wave of profound loneliness washed over him, so sharp it felt like physical pain. He turned abruptly, his knee protesting, and headed back towards the familiar lonely streets of Triana. He saw Carmen, the widow from the apartment below, sitting on a bench in the small plaza near his building, chatting with another neighbour. She smiled and waved as he approached. Matteo! A beautiful afternoon, no? He grunted a non-committal reply, intending to walk past. Are you feeling better? She asked, her gaze kind, perceptive. Elena told me you weren't well. He stiffened. Elena had been talking about him, discussing his weaknesses. I'm fine, he said curtly, the familiar defense mechanism kicking in, just enjoying the air. He nodded stiffly and walked on, ignoring the flicker of hurt in her eyes. Connection felt like exposure, another vulnerability he couldn't afford. Better to keep the walls up, high and strong. But as he climbed the stairs to his empty apartment, the silence seemed to roar in his ears, and the walls felt less like protection, more like a prison. He sank onto the sofa, the newspaper unread beside him, and stared at the opposite wall, seeing nothing but the long, empty stretch of the afternoon ahead. The pills remained in the drawer. The crisis, when it came, wasn't dramatic like a sudden collapse in the street. It arrived quietly, insidiously, in the dead of night. Matteo woke abruptly, a crushing weight on his chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. Pain, sharp and terrifying, radiated down his left arm. His heart wasn't just hammering now, it felt like it was tearing itself apart. This wasn't dizziness. This wasn't his knee. This was the abyss opening beneath him. Panic, stark and absolute, seized him. He gasped for air, the room spinning violently. Images flooded his mind. Sophia's face, pale and worried in her final weeks. Elena's exasperated pleas. The doctor's grave warning. Dangerously high. Stroke. Heart attack. He'd been a fool, a stubborn, proud fool, marching willingly towards this cliff edge. He fumbled for the lamp, knocking a glass of water to the floor. The crash barely registered over the roaring in his ears. He needed help. The admission ripped through decades of ingrained stoicism. He couldn't manage this alone. The thought of dying here, alone in this silent apartment, found by Elena hours or days later, the image was unbearable. His hand shook violently as he reached for the phone on the bedside table. His fingers felt thick, clumsy. He squinted at the screen, trying to focus on Elena's number. Pride, fear, regret warred within him, but the primal instinct to survive, the sudden, desperate desire to see another sunrise over the Guadalquivir, finally won. He pressed the call button, the sound of the ringing echoing in the suffocating silence, each ring an eternity. "Papa?" Elena's voice, thick with sleep, instantly sharp with alarm at the late hour. "Elena," he gasped, the single word costing him immense effort. "Help, chest." The rest was a blur of efficiency and fear. Elena's voice, suddenly calm and commanding, giving instructions. The wail of an ambulance siren growing closer, echoing strangely loud in the narrow Triana street, strange hands lifting him, bright lights overhead, the sterile smell of the emergency room, beeping machines. Urgent voices speaking a language of crisis he didn't understand. Through the haze of pain and medication, he was dimly aware of Elena's presence, her hand gripping his, her face pale but resolute. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a fierce determination. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the currents pulling him under, a single fragile thought anchoring him. He wasn't alone. Weeks later, Matteo sat by the window of his apartment. The afternoon light, softer now as winter approached, illuminated the familiar room. Things were different. The unopened boxes of pills were gone from the drawer. A neat weekly pill organizer sat on the kitchen counter instead. Twice a week, a young, cheerful physiotherapist named Rosa came, patiently guiding him through exercises that left his knee aching, but slowly, undeniably, feeling stronger. He still didn't like it. He chafed under the routines, the dietary restrictions, the quiet authority of Rosa, and the stern reminders from Elena. The old Matteo, the proud, independent man, still lurked inside, muttering resentful comments in the back of his mind. But something fundamental had shifted that night. Staring into the abyss had cracked the rigid shell he'd built around himself. He had survived a hypertensive crisis, bordering on a minor heart event. More tests had followed, adjustments to medication, stern lectures about compliance. This time, he listened. Not with enthusiasm, perhaps, but with a grudging acceptance born of fear and a dawning awareness of his own fragility. Elena visited more often now, not just as a caregiver, but as a daughter. Their conversations were still sometimes awkward, punctuated by silences, but the underlying tension had eased. He found himself asking about her children, listening, really listening to her stories about work. He even managed a clumsy video call with Javier, enduring the technological frustration to see his son's face, to hear his voice bridging the distance. He was sitting there, watching the life unfold on Calle Pureza below, when he saw Carmen returning from the market, her shopping trolley bumping over the cobblestones. On impulse, an impulse that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, he pushed open the window slightly. "Carmen," he called out. His voice sounded rusty. She looked up, surprised, then smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Matteo, good afternoon. Feeling stronger today?" He hesitated. The old instinct to retreat, to grunt a non-committal reply, warred with something new, something